So in order to kind of explain where Koi is coming from, I wanted to do a little bit of background about how we got into this and why Arweave is so awesome. Because sometimes I think we miss some of this stuff as we're getting into it. A little disclaimer before we dive in. I'm going to make some bad analogies and metaphors and gloss some stuff over, but happy to discuss stuff after the fact if anybody has any questions. I'm on the Discord, also on Twitter pretty actively, pretty happy to chat. So to start off with, I'd love to talk a little bit about what blockchain is, because I think this kind of explains why Arweave is so significant, and some people seem to miss this when they first come into the ecosystem. With a blockchain, typically you have permanent storage and then you have consensus as to what goes into that storage. And this is really, really cool because this just allows you to have this giant permanent thing that people can add to. And this was groundbreaking with Bitcoin. Ethereum kind of remixed that a little bit. And now we've seen a lot of people doing different stuff. Before we continue though, I'm gonna have like several of these slides, and they're basically definition slides. So we got our subject blockchain here, permanent storage, and social consensus. I'm gonna try to not be too pedantic as I go through these stuff. So I mentioned that Ethereum kind of remixed this concept. Ethereum took the Bitcoin idea of a blockchain and they said, okay, it's a state transition. So you take the first state and then you go through and you get to the second state. And this is a huge innovation because it changed around how people actually did blockchain a lot. Our friend Vitalik here gave everybody a lot of Lambos by changing the game. The funny thing though is the smart contract thing that he invented actually had a lot of other applications. And as we know, working with SmartWeave, you can do really, really interesting things with it. So the thing that's happened with SmartWeave is that basically now we have just literally any code and then a bunch of signatures and storage. And that's pretty much a smart contract. You just have all this information, you keep storing it over and over again, and you can put it into there, which is really neat. And so this is also kind of how NFTs work, right? And as the team at Verto have shown, there's some really amazing things that can be done with these on Arweave as well. Similarly with NFTs, especially on Arweave, you're storing a media file with a signature, which is kind of awesome because on all the other blockchains that try to do this, they actually they store the file somewhere else, and then they have the signature stored on another platform. So what we're thinking with Koi is that there's sort of an opportunity to take the internet as we currently see it, break it all up into little pieces, sign those pieces and give them ownership, and possibly put them all up into Arweave. So that's kind of what we've been thinking about with Koi. The funny thing about this though, and a lot of people have been looking at this problem, is that storing things into a permanent medium can be tricky. So in the slide about Ethereum, I mentioned the state transition concept. And so this is this idea of chains of blocks, and you can only add one block at a time to the chain. The really cool thing about Arweave, though, is that with Arweave, you can dump pretty huge amounts of data into Arweave. And sometimes it doesn't even really need to go through the consensus process immediately. So with Koi, what we're playing with is trying to tweak that system. And we started out trying to do this to kind of do web scraping. Then we realized we could use it for attention tracking. But now we've realized that kind of Arweave could be the basis of a whole bunch of applications in the future. Just an absolutely wild amount of stuff that you can do with it. And yeah, so Arweave's really awesome. Thanks, Sam. As a slight digression, I'm not just showing a GIF of Sam here. If we click on this, we get an Arweave NFT. And some of you guys might already be familiar with these, but this is really neat because it's an image file, but it's also a smart contract. And so it's a smart contract with an image file inside of it. And that's incredible because that's like a new file type. That's like a new kind of like a JPEG or a PNG or something. Now we've got smart contracts that contain data. And you got your signature here, right? So this is actually basically, it's like a decentralized data store that controls little pieces of information, all kinds of places all over the world, and it's owned by somebody. So like right here, I think it's probably Tate or John, somebody from the Verto team, and it's owned, and it's got ownership, it's got properties. You go to contract, you've got the ability to transfer this to people. You've got some functions that are built into it. You've got your state. And this means that this little payload of data now has a life of its own, and it's going to continue existing, even if the original owner stops using it or stops looking at it. The really cool thing, especially with what we're doing at Koi, is that if you own one of these NFTs, other people will look at it, then we can give you Koi tokens for that, because we can track that something happened to that NFT at some point. The other really cool thing about this is the cost. So I don't know if you guys have looked at the Arweave price recently, but like, this is pretty cheap. It's like 2 pennies to be able to publish an image onto the PermaWeb forever. And so that, like, from an economics perspective, is just way, way better than anything we've been doing before. So here's a few slides. I wasn't sure if that link was going to work, so we have all these in here. But this really means a lot of really cool things can be done on top of Arweave, because it's incredibly composable. And you've got these functionalities that are just built into your data set. So kind of playing with this a little bit with Koi, but generally speaking, proof of access is kind of a miracle. And it's going to completely change the game for most of the blockchain applications that are out there, because now we're storing the data, and we don't necessarily have to always find consensus as to what the data means right away. We can do that after the fact, as long as we can store all of it. So here's some great images I found on Google Images about proof of access. Generally speaking, this concept of recall block, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, is pretty amazing. Kind of, it sort of disconnects the requirement to store things and makes it sort of an open competition to make sure that everybody's storing as much of the information as possible. It makes a huge difference. So the future of blockchain or the future of blockweave? It's the real question. Personally, I think the blockweave is coming along quite well. So anyways, a little bit about Koi. Where we started out with Koi, we were looking at this concept of kind of tag databases that map the internet. So we were looking at kind of how Google operates and how large data companies create the indexes that they use. And the thing that we noticed is, well, you know, tags are everything, right? And people in the last couple of presentations have talked about GraphQL and why that's so important. But, you know, if you look at Google's information system that they've created and their IP, the most valuable IP that they have is their tag database. So we started out with Koi trying to create something similar. We wanted to go and scrape a lot of websites, because if you scrape enough websites, then you can create your own tag database. So we worked on a way to standardize things, to kind of like boil down a website like this into you know, a more structured data payload that you can use for all kinds of other applications, that it's going to be standardized across different websites, that could be in an open place. So we started out looking at this problem, and that kind of took us down this rabbit hole of trying to get nodes to do very interesting things. We brought it over to Sam to ask if he would give us some free storage, and he was really supportive of looking at other applications as well. So something we realized with this is that, you know, we don't just have to go and scrape websites with this. We can get the same node that's scraping a website to go and hit a traffic gateway and request some logs from it. So we can do some other really interesting things. And this has kind of led us to this point now where we're looking at Koi as a way to provide kind of backend services for some DApps. So things like web scraping can be done. Things like attention tracking come with it out of the box. So we've got that pretty much up and running at the moment. But the gist of it is, if you wanted to build a decentralized application on top of the Arweave, we can help you to use our nodes, which have caching for some Arweave contracts, which have attention tracking out of the box, and help you to create your own tokens that run on top of Arweave, so that you can build really cool applications without having to do all the heavy lifting. Similarly to what ArConf is doing to try and make it easier for people to use kind of browser extensions to use their public keys and private keys, we are also hoping that we can build a kind of framework of components so that it's really easy for you to build apps that can interact with, you know, Arweave specifically, but also just with nodes that might need to do different things, possibly something with Hive, that kind of thing, to make it really easy for you to build these PermaWeb apps. Because really the way that we see it is all of this information should be on the PermaWeb. There's really no reason for it not to be. There's a ton of stuff out there, and it would be great if we could start to record these things, you know, for posterity, but also for cross-referencing and permanence, and just to make sure that things don't get taken down over time. Quick note on the proofs of real traffic. It sounds a little bit weird to be able to track attention. People think, wow, you could really easily spam that kind of thing. So what we're working on here is having our nodes actually record the traffic that's coming through them. And so we've written a little bit of middleware that goes onto the Amplify gateways, and it allows content viewers to submit these proofs. And it's an optional thing that they can opt into. But if you submit these proofs, which require a little bit of hashing, a little bit of kind of signing with your private key, once you submit a proof like this, though, you've you've actually proven that you've been to a certain page and that you've invested in it with your time and your energy. And this can be stored into Arweave. And so when we store these into Arweave, the coin nodes can come along and vote on them. And so every 24 hours, what we do is we go through all these traffic logs. We look at whose traffic got the most views over that period. And then we assign our 1,000 koi tokens every day. And so we're creating these tokens from thin air. But if you want to access them, you actually have to register content to the coin network. So it creates kind of an interesting economic cycle where people are incentivized to burn koi tokens so they can access future koi tokens. But in the process, we create a framework that allows us to reward the content creators themselves without necessarily having an intermediary, like an advertiser or something like that, to actually pay them. So there's lots more on this. If you have questions about it, we're really excited to talk through how this can work. And I think there's a lot of applications on Arweave that could benefit from it substantially. To give you an idea of kind of how we see Arweave going, and by no means is this the koi stack here. This is kind of just a generalized roadmap that we're hoping to help kind of bring into light. Most of Arweave will probably be involved in a very similar pursuit. So the way that we see this happening at the moment, we've been building a lot of kind of client-side frameworks to make it really easy for our koi.rocks portal to operate. But that combined with the kind of web scraping and services infrastructure that we're building with koi nodes should allow us to provide a pretty simple framework for people to use. And by no means does this have to be a koi framework. If you've got something on Arweave that is useful, like Phil's ArDrive, for example, would be a really great application here. We'd love to try and incorporate it because that will allow us to make it really easy for other people to come into the ecosystem and build apps on top of the Arweave. The easier it is for people who are coming in to start to build new applications, the faster the ecosystem will grow. And we'll be bringing in more and more customers because people can come in and quickly package all these things together and build an application. And I think that's really where this kind of goes in the long term. I think RVerify probably is ahead of the game here because as all of these, PermaWeb apps get built, what we're going to see is that we're going to have a reputation kind of graph that allows us to say, this piece of content came from this person. This other person viewed it. And if the second person there has a really strong reputation, then we can say, well, that piece of content, by having been viewed by a bunch of people with strong reputations, is actually probably a pretty strong piece of content. And that's how we kind of get to this future that doesn't have Google having the only map of the internet. It's a system where we have an open map of the internet that everybody can access. And if we do that successfully, then we don't actually have to have a private version of it anywhere. We can just keep it all out in the open. And if we can build incentives on top of that, like the koi token and others that have presented here today, we have the potential to build something that can basically continue to exist in perpetuity. That, private organizations tend to fail eventually. That's why empires collapse. They tend to be rent-seeking. They suck a lot of profit out where they shouldn't. But what we have the potential to do here is to build something that can just sustain itself. It's an open door that anybody can come and build on top of. It makes it really easy for other people to provide value for each other and kind of enrich the ecosystem as it grows. So the purpose of the koi token is that we create 1,000 of them every day and we give them out to people who are publishing content into the network. But when we say the network here, we mean the Arweave PermaWeb in general. So if you have anything on Arweave that's going to be generating a lot of attention, we'd love to have you register it with koi. The cool thing is that if you register that content, you can also come and use coin nodes for things. So we're working on making it really easy to cache SmartWave contracts, also working on kind of like a buffer functionality so that you can write images and like kind of have multiple SmartWave interactions happen in sequence so that you don't have to wait for them each to go through. And then you can also come along if you wanted to run a coin node or run some kind of a service and earn some of these tokens as well. So the idea here is to kind of create a virtuous cycle that results in more content getting added to the Arweave and actually to reward the content that is the best that the most people are looking at. So it kind of goes in two directions there. We just closed a pre-sale round. We're trying to raise a little bit more money, but we're aiming for a public sale a little later this year. And for us is use Arweave because we can launch a token anytime. It's not the most important part. Really, the reason we really think that it'll allow Arweave and the PermaWeb to exist well beyond any of our lifetimes. Thanks for taking the time to listen.